Welcome to the Canna-Manual podcast, hosted by Global Cannabinoid Solutions, the world's leading cannabis science firm and cannabis market entry specialists. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on this latest episode of Canna-Manual.
Welcome everyone to this next episode of the Canna-Manual podcast. We have with us today Lored Devito. For those who don't know you, Loren, would you mind just introducing yourself slightly and letting people know a bit about your background, who you are, where you are, that sort of thing? That'd be, I think, a nice start for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Chris. I'm really excited to be here talking to you today. I have been working in the cannabis industry for about 4 or 5 years, mostly on the sort of educational side of things. So just for a quick background, I got my PhD at Boston University in neuroscience. I then did a postdoc in Toronto, which is where I am now. And then after my postdoc, I realized I wanted to leave the traditional research field. I'd always really loved writing and sort of the more traditional kind of literature search aspects. I actually loved writing my dissertation and loved writing manuscripts.
And that's very rare, Loren, as well.
Oh my God, it's so rare. Everybody was like, what is wrong with you? I just want to be at the bench all day, which, I enjoyed that aspect as well. But I was so fortunate to have an amazing advisor who was very prominent in the field of memory research, but he was also an amazing writer. He wrote several books. He was always working on reviews or other papers. So my advisor, Howard Eichenbaum, who passed a few years ago, was just a wonderful influence on me, because when I decided to transition into medical writing, I feel like I was very, very well prepared. So I moved back to New York about 10 years ago, and I started working at some medical education companies. So transitioned a little bit more into healthcare and medicine versus, research. So I obviously love neuroscience. That'll always be first in my heart, but I learned a lot about a lot of different disease states, anything from cardiovascular disease to genetic disorders to oncology. So I'm still very much working in that field. But as I said, in the last few years, I also got into cannabis science education. So I always say I have my research background in neuroscience, but I never researched cannabis. I studied in graduate school some of the social and cognitive deficits in schizophrenia using animal models in which genes were knocked down. So we could study sort of a single pathway and a single gene and how that affected behavior in mice. And people would always ask me, like, what does a schizophrenic mouse look like? And I would say, I don't know. We're not trying to model the disease as a whole, although, some other groups use different methods. But I was specifically looking at, how certain genes and pathways would affect memory as well as just sociability. So, people with schizophrenia actually experience sort of 3 categories of symptoms. So the first being positive symptoms, which people are most familiar with. So that would be hallucinations, delusions. And then we have negative symptoms, which are flat affect, some symptoms that are a little bit similar to depression. And then we have cognitive symptoms, which are definitely less well recognized. And that's, anything from memory and attentional issues. And, the medications we have right now, mostly that affect dopamine, are better at controlling the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. A huge unmet need remains in helping patients deal with sort of the negative symptoms as well as the cognitive symptoms. So that was more of my area of domain. And then in my postdoctoral research, I was studying a genetic model of Alzheimer's disease. And again, this was a situation where several genes were disrupted. And so we did have a very aggressive model of Alzheimer's. But again, I hesitate to say that any of our animal models are schizophrenic or have Alzheimer's disease. So, I was always really interested in neurology and psychiatry and a lot of the clinical applications of the work I was doing, although unfortunately I never got to work directly with a patient population. So I think, those facets were always kind of, very interesting to me and kind of stayed with me. And then in terms of cannabis, I actually, I was doing a lot of article writing for different, health websites, and, I was doing a lot of content development and sort of my full-time job. So I actually got my first opportunity with Ganjapreneur, which is a great magazine, and I saw a posting, and I just wrote to them about, my curiosity in cannabis and how much I wanted to write about the science of it. And so that's where I kind of got going. From there, I was able to write for more of a science news site called Lab Roots, and they had just started a cannabis science section. So I was writing for that vertical for a little while. And then I got a freelance position at Mace Media, and I was there for about 3 years. It's a wonderful group of publications. They also do conferences, and they offer a lot of educational opportunities for physicians and consumers. And so I was writing about CBD science. I was writing about some more technical aspects of, cannabis growth and extraction and policy. And I was doing about 2 blogs a week. So I got fully immersed quickly. I was doing a lot of interviews, and I think you can agree, Chris, that the best way to learn is really to listen to people and what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I mean, the inspirational stories just blew me away. I mean, it was incredible that everyone who developed a business that I spoke to had a personal connection with cannabis, or use cannabis as medication for their loved ones. And it was really wonderful. And for about 1.5 years, I was the editor-in-chief of CBD Health and Wellness, and that was, again, a tremendous opportunity to connect with so many different people, to kind of design the editorial calendar and figure out what content needed to go in the print magazine. That was a bi-monthly magazine, and we still had our weekly blogs and our webinars and all of that. So I left earlier in the year. I can talk more about this. So I'm also a cannabis medicine patient. I have endometriosis, which not a lot of people are familiar with. So just a brief summary is basically it's a condition where endometrial cells, which usually only sit in the uterus, actually grow outside. It can affect a lot of areas in the body, mostly the pelvic area, and it causes intense pain. It causes fatigue. It's an inflammatory condition. People experience what's called flares. Oftentimes they're, once a month and correspond with hormonal changes. There's really no good treatment. Hormonal treatments have a lot of side effects. Surgery is considered the gold standard, but it comes back. So I found that cannabis was just the best pain medication that I could use. I never wanted to touch an opioid or a very strong painkiller. So, that's sort of my passion, is how it's changed my life, how it's allowed me to have more of a, functioning day-to-day where I still have pain, but it's more manageable. So I really am grateful. Being in Canada now with full access is amazing. I was in New York before that, which just recently legalized, but there are no dispensaries there, and their medical program was actually pretty limited. So that's sort of a long-winded answer of how I got here.
That's the scope of the conversation pretty perfect. So you've painted out the whole timeline for what I'd love to speak with you. It all works out.
Sure.
And taking it all the way back to the start, what I wanted to sort of touch on was just some of the genetic research and how, and I think in the interest of trying to make science a bit more tangible for people, what could you give some examples as to how genetics can influence cognition, schizophrenia, for example? Because again, like, I think schizophrenia particularly, and I'm sure you can unpick this a bit better than I can, but there's a lot of stigma. We talk about cannabis and the stigma around cannabis and the taboos, but then there's this additional stigma around mental conditions. But schizophrenia has this, maybe it's more noticeable. I don't know what the origins of that are, but there's always, particularly in, society, schizophrenia is a tough topic, and it seems to be something that people are very scared of as well. And so, if you could maybe help us make that a bit more tangible and understand again some of the genetic factors and some sort of real world examples of that would be super, because it's a pretty out there, it's not something like, it's rare to be exposed to that sort of condition, and if you do, it's sort of like washed away and you don't talk about it or you don't see it. And so, yes, Loren, if you could help us digest some of that, that would be, I think, a really nice second point to touch upon.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, there's still tremendous stigma in schizophrenia for the general population. Mental health overall has seen a lot of improvements, but it's still difficult for a lot of people to talk about it openly. So in terms of schizophrenia, like I said, there's 3 big buckets of symptoms that people can have. It's a very heterogeneous disorder. So some people may express, the majority of positive symptoms, where others may be, experiencing a lot of negative symptoms, or their positive symptoms are more well controlled. We know that positive symptoms are correlated with dopamine levels in the brain. So higher dopamine levels, will cause a lot of those positive symptoms. It's a disorder of many areas in the brain. Obviously, we know that there's auditory and visual hallucinations. So you've got the occipital as well as auditory cortices involved. The prefrontal cortex is very much involved. It's the part of the brain that controls decision making, and of course, disordered thinking is going to affect the prefrontal cortex. The area of the brain that I is the hippocampus, so that is the main center for memory. It's important to note, though, that these areas are heavily connected, and there's a lot of feed forward and feedback connections. In terms of genetics, I'll first talk about sort of the main neurotransmitters. So, like I said, we have dopamine. Dopamine is really important for motor movements as well as reward and a lot of sort of higher level thinking. The interesting thing about schizophrenia is, dopamine levels are too high. In Parkinson's disorder, dopamine levels are too low. So if you're giving an agent to a patient with schizophrenia and you're trying to lower their levels of dopamine, if they become too low, you've got these uncontrolled motor movements, which are similar to Parkinson's. Right. So it's not just that it's dopamine. It's a lot of different neurotransmitters. So what I was studying in particular was the glutamate system, and glutamate is known to be an excitatory neurotransmitter, and that means largely that it propagates excitatory signal. So step back a little bit. So the brain works largely through chemical and electrical signaling. And you've got sort of these excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. So inhibitory says stop, excitatory says go. However, with the brain, nothing is that simple. So we also have, interneurons, for example, and they're inhibitory, right? But it also depends on the receptors that sit on these different neurons, right? So in terms of the glutamatergic pathway, there's a strong bidirectional pathway between the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. So there is a lot of communication, feed forward and feedback. So we have this strong network of sort of these higher level cognitive processes going on in the prefrontal cortex, these, memory processes that are going on in the hippocampus, and they communicate because the hippocampus is very important for encoding memory, and then, consolidated memory will kind of scatter to these other areas. But in terms of schizophrenia, you do have this really strong connection between these brain regions. And so you have glutamate, again, excitatory, and then you have something called GABA, and GABA is mainly inhibitory. So you have this interplay of, well, where are the GABA neurons? And if they're disinhibited, does that mean there's more, excitation into the prefrontal cortex? So those are three neurotransmitters that interact in a very complex manner.
I guess that's similar to the endocannabinoid system as well, in that we've got the endocannabinoids. It's not just, I think a lot of people think it's just maybe CBD and THC, the external ones, and don't realize the mess that we have to unpick that is the endocannabinoid system as well. If you had to sort of describe the brain, Loren, and how people could maybe, I guess what I'm asking for is like, what's your sort of mental model of the brain? How do you like picture it, and how do you sort of, because it is such a complex thing, how do you sort of visualize that? And yeah, touching on learning best from speaking to people, like what's your mental model of the brain, and how do you sort of remember it and understand it? And could we steal that from?
Yeah. So like I said, in school, you kind of learn this region does this and that region does this. And if there's damage to this region, such and such happens. It's a network, neuronal connections between all of the different regions are really what drives behavior. And it's interesting because, you're speaking before about genetics, and the genetic contributions to different disorders are so complex. We've identified, a lot of them, but there's still so much else we need to learn about genetic interplays. But yeah, it's all about connections. It's all about sort of, I take the behavioral systems approach. So if we want to study, particular memory, we could knock down a gene and see what happens. But when we knock down a gene in a mouse model, we knock it down everywhere. So if we just want to study the effect of like one gene in one particular area, there are methods to do that. And one of those methods is using viral vectors. So you basically create this vector that will specifically knock down a particular receptor in the brain. So some of the work I did was on the NMDA receptor, which is very, very important for learning and memory. And this is part of the glutamatergic system. And basically what we did is we infused this viral vector into certain parts of the hippocampus. So we wanted to know, for example, CA2 is a component of the hippocampus. It's just a little area, and people don't know much about it, right? So we were trying to see, if knocking down NMD receptors at a certain period of learning might disrupt that behavior. And that was some of the work that I was doing sort of at the end of my graduate career. So there are ways to knock down genes in parts of the brain. But when you think about, models of a disease, they're probably going to have genetic disruptions everywhere. So there's pros and cons of using different approaches like that. But there are a lot of ways we can study that. And then again, of course, when we go into the patient population, we're going to be using fMRI. So we're going to be looking at, different imaging techniques, looking at the signal change and oxygenation level in the blood. There are limitations of those techniques, of course, because we may see inhibitory activity, we may see excitatory activity, and so we can say those correlate with XYZ, but we don't exactly know what's going on. And obviously there are ethical considerations of doing neuroscience research. We have been able to do recordings in patients with epilepsy, because a lot of times, they're already going to be undergoing a lot of these sorts of tests, but then again, we're studying it in a patient population versus a healthy brain. So neuroscience is hard, science is hard. People need to be patient with, with these results. But to go back to your original question, yes, it is a system of networks. And when we look at the role of the endocannabinoid system in the brain, obviously, many people have said this, it's a modulatory system, right? So uniquely, it works in the brain through retrograde signaling. So to be simple, you have two neurons that are chatting with each other, and they do this in a little space. It's called the synapse between the cells. And you've got presynaptic here, you got postsynaptic here, right? This is the signal is going, in one direction. We have endocannabinoids that are produced in the postsynaptic cell, but they actually feed back to the presynaptic cell. So what this means is that the endocannabinoids actually alter the function of the presynaptic cell, which influences what happens in the postsynaptic cell. So that's a bit complicated, but it works very differently the way neurons usually work in the brain. And there are other situations of retrograde signaling. And yet, endocannabinoids and, phytocannabinoids also have more direct effects as well, particularly on CB1 receptors. However, CBD in particular actually is a promiscuous, cannabinoid because it affects a whole host of neurotransmitters in the brain. Serotonin is a really important one, and that's what affects mood and eating and a lot of different things. So, CBD is going to affect more than CB1 and CB2. So, that modulatory effect is going to just, kind of be global throughout the brain. So that's why we think we see a lot of this sort of, calming effects of CBD. As you said, it's not just about CBD and THC. We're learning more and more every day about the minor cannabinoids. They're showing up in products everywhere. I have a note of caution there saying that, this is the first time we're using isolates, and there's a lot we don't know, and there's some controversy as to how we extract some of those. So, every time I see a product like CBN and sleep, if it works, great. I haven't seen the data. I'm waiting on the data for that. So obviously this kind of lends itself to a safety conversation, right? So there's two aspects of safety that I think are really important. So we talk a lot about how the product was made, how it was tested, are there heavy metals, are there pesticides? Again, this is more on the, non-regulated side of cannabis. But it, of course, applies to the legal industry as well. So we talk about how safe are those products. Then when we take those products, we also need to consider safety. So we all know that cannabis is a relatively safe drug. However, it does interact with other medications in the body. So I always encourage people, tell your doctor you're taking it. It's not that easy in places where it's not legal and physicians have a bias. But they need to know. I went in for surgery and I was like, listen, I use cannabis medicinally. could that affect anesthesia? And the anesthesiologist didn't really respond, but I've seen some data where it does. And if you're a heavy user, you know, it's really going to influence a lot of different factors. So I always tell people to be very straightforward.
Would you be able to sort of, again, taking this out of the black and white text, which probably written about quite a lot, but what is it about, and I say what is it about cannabis that causes that interaction, but could you like break down that interaction for viewers, Loren? Because
Yeah.
obviously a lot of this then has impact in the brain, and
Yeah.
and again, drug consumption in general, I think a lot of people don't realize how that moves into the body as well.
Yeah.
So for that, what we were just talking about there was quite that one word, that interaction, there's quite a big a lot going on behind the scenes in that. So would you be able to sort of unmask some of that, I guess, for any patients or sort of consumers that are maybe interested in that really want to know some of this, I guess.
Yeah, so there are 4 main processes by which you which the body breaks down medications, and this is anything you consume. You know, we talk about drugs in a particular way, but I've got my caffeine, I use my ibuprofen when I need to. These all affect the body and the brain. So we need to stop with the whole dichotomy between what is a drug and what is not. If it's a bioactive substance, then it's going to be, you know, it's going to go through the body in a specific way. So first we have absorption, and that depends on, you know, where is it touching the body first. So if we inhale smoke, that's going directly into our lungs. If we take an edible, that's going to go through our digestive system. If it's a topical, it's going to, you know, hopefully be absorbed by the skin. So that's the first step, is absorption. Then we have metabolism. So again, it's considered first pass metabolism if it's going through the stomach and the digestive system. You know, smoking is going to bypass first pass metabolism, and that's why the effects come on more quickly. And, you know, there's always people, you know, unsure about how edibles work, and their onset of action is much slower because they do have to pass through the digestive system and then get into the bloodstream. So then we have distribution. So once it's in the body, it's going to travel up to different areas, of course, the brain. And then the final excretion step is basically, you know, when it gets out of the body and how long it takes to get out of the body. When it's metabolized in the liver, this is where we see some drug-drug interactions. So cannabis is broken down through CYP450. It's a common pathway, and it's affected by a lot of different medications. So there's a possibility of, you know, drug-drug interactions of pretty much every drug that's approved. There's when you have an approved drug that's prescribed by your doctor, you get this long document nobody reads called the prescribing information. And there's a list of drug-drug interactions. And so a physician and a pharmacist needs to be very, very clear on what those drug interactions are, and to not prescribe 2 drugs together that are going to produce adverse effects. So that's really the crux of what we're talking about in terms of safety. And then we have the situation where, okay, now cannabis is in the brain doing its thing. Now, there's a lot of data that have come out saying that, you know, cannabis can negatively impact the adolescent brain. And, you know, development is an important time. You know, the brain kind of stops, I would say, developing in your late 20s. And it's interesting because that's when you see patients with schizophrenia actually presenting with a lot of their first symptoms. So in terms of schizophrenia, you know, a lot of patients go through the prodromal phase, and that basically means that symptoms are starting to emerge and they don't really know what's going on. So that might be happening in sort of the high school to college years. So there's this, you know, chicken and egg situation that's still being hotly debated in the literature. We know that there's a correlation between cannabis use and schizophrenia. However, we don't know if patients that are experiencing these sort of early symptoms may be self-medicating with cannabis. And that's where that correlation comes from. Or cannabis is contributing to, schizophrenia. So there's so many studies published about this.
Correlation and causation aren't necessarily the same, are they? No.
Very, very different things. Yeah.
The funny thing is, over the years, I've spoken to a lot of schizophrenics, and they've told me that like I was smoking cannabis as a result of the schizophrenia. Because cognitively, that's the only thing that sort of calms the thoughts rather than necessarily just the body and the muscles. And so that's a really important point that I don't think I'm gonna have to clip that as well because it was such a good point. But
it's very important, because for a lay consumer audience, they're going to read all of these, and I won't even get into the mainstream media's reporting on a lot of these studies, because there is such a negative bias out there, as we know, in cannabis, and what are the medical benefits, what are the risks, and how do we handle them. We have so much anecdotal evidence, right? This plant's been used for thousands of years across every culture imaginable. A lot of things have changed in the last few decades, this is not the cannabis your grandparents were using, at Woodstock. There were higher levels of CBD then. The industry and the consumer demand is, as much THC as you can, and that is not always a good idea. We know that there's a lot of unpleasant side effects from THC, depending on the dose, depending on the way that you consume it. We don't see that as much with CBD. Another point of contention with me is they're both psychoactive. Anything that affects the drug is psychoactive. CBD, in my opinion, is not intoxicating, and that is the main difference. And it's very sad that we see a lot of marketers still saying that, CBD is non-psychoactive. And
that's what our law is based on in the UK, Loren, that CBD is not psychoactive, therefore we're going to make it legal. It absolutely baffles me how, we can just make these arbitrary dictations that, in terms of like
it
scientific.
Makes people feel better. It makes policymakers feel better. I mean, I take CBD throughout the day and I'm able to work. If I took any amount of THC, I'm very sensitive. Forget it. My day is shot. I have a friend who uses RSO during the day and is fine. So everybody's different, genetics, prior use. If, people have been using cannabis for many years, their tolerance is, very different than mine. But again, I really do think that genetics plays a large role in sensitivity to the effects of different cannabinoids. And we're still trying to parse that out. I've seen some interesting genetic work in that area, but I still tell everyone, like, the consumer industry is way ahead of the research, and there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of interest. There are a lot of, I've said, I've talked to incredibly passionate people. There are people out there just looking to make a buck and not doing things correctly, and that's largely because this industry is unregulated, and policymakers don't understand it, and it's not led by science. But I'm so encouraged. I mean, I remember writing an article at the end of 2020 looking at, I don't even remember, like thousands of studies that came out on cannabis. And then I checked the end of this year and there was even more. So I even, I checked clinicaltrials.gov, which lists clinical trials across the world. And you just look for cannabis or some variations of cannabis, and the research is exploding. It's such an exciting time, but we're still in the infancy we've been held back for so many years because of its legal status. And so, I really am not a fan of rushing all of these, isolates out to market when we really don't understand them. And then on the other side of that, in the US at least, and the UK and other places where it's not legal, people want access. The whole Delta 8 craze came out because people wanted something like THC, but is legal. And then we get into the whole situation where, it's marketed as the lighter THC. Well, I tried it because I wanted to know. And it's not lighter to me. You can take a higher dose, but you're still going to get the same effects. So people need to know that. And it's just not happening on the consumer side of things. So it's incredibly frustrating. There have been a lot of cases, again, not in the legal market. If you go to a legal dispensary and get a packet of edibles, my God, they are hard to open, like nearly impossible. I have struggled and given them to my partner and just like wanted to bang them against the wall.
Well.
Yeah. And then I see photos of, these bags that open as easily as candy that a child could grab, an animal could grab. So that is a huge safety risk that, the vaping crisis came out, right? E-Valley was the big thing in the news. Those were not legal vapes, guys. I mean, we got to consider the fact that, there's a lot of cannabis products floating around that are unregulated, and it's not the same as when people were selling flour, although there are issues there too. These are concentrates, and that's a whole other world when you take extraction into the process. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on that most of us are not too keen on, for sure.
You've touched on some beautiful points there, Loren, that, as you say, they're not quite mainstream media material, but they are sort of facts of the conversation, that more inconvenient truths. And I think things that are quite easy to sort of gloss over and skip over if you're, say, in media and marketing, you only want to focus on the target points and the core message, if you know what I mean. So we'll have to do, and I think I'm going to clip all of that, just because of how important it is. And I don't think I think maybe our scientific community does a pretty good job of talking about it, but we don't do a good enough job of telling the industry and consumers about it, I guess. Like between our LinkedIn conversations and things like that in our little LinkedIn bubble, we pretty good at talking about it, but it's how we filter that back out, I guess, as well. And I don't think that's really the main issues in the UK as well. And it's seems to be an international problem that's emerged. And obviously, if you've got, like you say, a whole new bunch of products, dumping them into the population and it's all unregulated, then you're just sort of asking for trouble, really, aren't you? And difficult for patients to navigate, and difficult for a business to sort of navigate as well. Is just like, where do you start? What do you use as an anchor point? Science isn't a bad spot to start, but
just
not
to
easy.
Your point to your point about LinkedIn, I mean, not everybody knows it's kind of this hub for cannabis science, and it's amazing because you connect with so many wonderful people. And most people ask me, like, why are you on LinkedIn all the time? Don't you already have a job? And I'm like, yeah, but I get to talk to cannabis people. We don't get to do that on other social media platforms because they get shut down right away. So even if you're trying to share pure educational content that has nothing to do with products, you will get shut down by other sites. And that is something that we grapple with a lot in the community. So I think LinkedIn has become this very safe space for us. And I greatly appreciate that. And have just met so many incredible people through that, channel. But I'll say one more thing, I promise, short, about dosing, because like you said, if someone's interested in cannabis, they'll probably come to me at some point if they're, a friend or a family member and ask me, the basics. What's the best product to try, this and this and that. And then it comes to dosing, and I'm at a loss, to be honest. Again, I always tell them, like, I am not a physician. I'm not giving you medical advice, but I may know more than your doctor does, to put that, in context. I don't know where to begin with dosing. I am so tired of the, start low, go like, how have we not evolved past that at this point?
Yeah.
And the dichotomy there is that we have cannabinoids that are going through the traditional pharmaceutical testing phase 1 to phase 3 process to be approved by regulatory bodies such as Epidiolex, approved in the UK, approved in the US for epilepsy. And then we've got all these other products that we just talked about that are available for consumers. So, in a clinical trial, you're going to be testing very discrete doses, and you're going to be monitored by physicians and investigators. And by the end, we're going to know the effects of this dose taken X number of times a day on, X symptoms. Well, what if you have anxiety and just want to sleep? How many milligrams should I be taking? I was once at a medical dispensary in New York, and this older woman was very concerned that, she's not sure if the CBD is working. A lot of people say, I always tell them to stick with it, but I'm not going to tell you to stay on it if it's, not helping you. And she was like, using a millimeters, plastic syringe that they often come in. And she's like, what if I increase it by like 0.1? Is that okay? And the person was like, yeah, that's fine. And I'm like sitting in the room seething, like, what is 0.1 going to do for you? Like, there's this huge disconnect, and I still struggle with that personally. I've had to just play around with the dosing myself. And
you throw a body size in there as well, like me compared to your grandma.
Oh my God, sure.
And then I'm on a few prescription medications as well. You just think, oh my God, I give up. And again, you can see why, again, from a medical perspective, there's so much to wrap your head around and sort of intertwine into your existing medical knowledge. It's an incredibly difficult place to start. And again, consumer wise, where do you start as well? Like, it's all very confusing products, a multitude of uses, and so it's not as simple as problem CBD product, and everyone's the same. And it's, we've got a lot of white label products, but it's not quite a white label conversation, is it? You've got a lot of nuances and a lot of variability, and just a bit of a spectrum of a conversation more so, isn't it? I suppose that.
It's so complicated. I wish it weren't. But the complexity makes this such a beautiful system and makes it such a beautiful plant, because, right now, left and right, you're seeing articles about psychedelics, completely shifting the way that, psychiatry will practice forever. There are incredible results coming out in top journals, and I have been following the story for a while, and it's amazing. However, I see a lot of people in cannabis kind of like moving into psychedelics, which I understand. It makes sense. It's plant medicine. But I urge people to stick with cannabis as part of their practice, as part of their research, because we have great data for psychedelics and mental health. I'm sure there's going to be more coming out in other areas, but cannabis has potential uses for so many conditions. And we need to stay focused on picking apart, the different cannabinoids, the terpene effects. I'm sick of seeing products with terpenes. I want to know which ones. I want to know the percentages. Same with cannabinoids. Right now we're still kind of playing around with stuff on our own, medical or recreational. but we need to drill down in our research. We need to look at this dose of THC, THC with CBD, THC with CBG, CBD with it, like all these different.
It's a whole catalog, isn't it, that needs a whole database really that needs populating.
Yeah, and the problem is, for many years and still now, we're doing prospective observational studies on, okay, this person is reporting using cannabis like a lot, this person uses it a little, and then here are results. And it's like, how do I interpret these data? How? What kind of cannabis? What's in it? How do they take it? What does moderate use mean? What does heavy use mean? I don't find that data useful.
What I did want to ask as one, and I feel like we've sort of skipped over a couple of things here, and we'll have to like delve in a bit deeper. And I'll keep saying this conversation, but we will do a bit more of a cohort conversation, and we can talk. I think we could have a bit more of a science conversation. So we do talk. We've scattered across everything here, but if we
that's my fault. I go off on tangents a lot.
It was what needed to happen, though. It's framing the conversation, and just paints a bit of a picture. But I guess there's so much again that we've to digest as part of this conversation. It's hard to get it all in, say, an hour. It's 100-year conversation, many thousands of year conversation. So what I did want to ask, Loren, was sort of, and this is for the students and maybe people looking at getting into science as well. Lots more people, and I'd say a lot more young people getting more and more interested in this field because it is an interesting, like, topical area of research. And so you touched on a couple of things. Finding a good tutor seems to be one of those things that helps, and being passionate about your subject. But like, what advice would you have for people that want to do PhDs or that would like to get into research or academia? What sort of lessons, could you share with anyone that's thinking about getting into this sort of field and medical research as well?
Sure. Having gone through a PhD, I'd say don't do it because you're interested. Do it because you are committed to either a career in research or a career in, applied sciences. So I think, I went right from university into graduate school, and that's less common these days. A lot of people just to kind of figure it out. But I was, hell bent on this is what I want to do. I love neuroscience. I, did research for 2 years in university. I'd highly recommend anyone in university who might be interested in science and research, volunteer or do work study in a lab. You'll learn the nitty and gritty. I mean, it's more than just, coming up with hypotheses and reading papers all day. Like, I was in a windowless basement with mice for years. And because mice are nocturnal, we had to do everything in a dimly lit room. So it takes a physical toll on you. It takes a mental toll on you. So I started out thinking this was going to be so great and so fun. And you quickly learn that this is brutally hard work. If you stay in academia, don't expect to make a lot of money. We don't do it for money. We do it because we love it. And that's fine. But there's challenges to getting faculty positions. Postdocs are becoming longer and longer. So you can't go into it thinking like, I'm definitely going to become a professor. Like, that just may not be realistic. And it has nothing to do with your ability to do research well. It's just the reality of the situation. So I would certainly spend time looking into different aspects of work that one can do with a master's or a PhD. So there are certainly opportunities in pharmaceutical research labs. I knew nothing about medical writing. I just happened to have a colleague who did it and helped intro me to the industry. There are a lot of opportunities in startups right now. It is a very exciting time. If you are interested in going into the cannabis industry, there's a huge need for lab personnel in terms of extraction and things like that, and sort of either smaller pharmaceutical companies that are focusing solely on cannabis and cannabis compounds, or larger pharmaceutical companies that are also looking into cannabis. But you got to do research because you love it, and you should be really driven by that. And that doesn't necessarily mean you get a master's or a PhD. I know a lot of writers that didn't have a background in, biology, but learned about cannabis and taught themselves. Like I said, I don't have a research background in cannabis. I read all the time. I talk to as many people as I can. I listen to podcasts. I think what's interesting about cannabis is because it's such a new field in terms of the data that are coming out right now, there are just tons of opportunities. And if you're a self-starter, you will do very well, because you need to be very proactive and reaching out to people and seeing the opportunities for you. But I really see with regulations changing, especially here in Canada, right? We have more funding opportunities for research. It's like I said, research has been held back by the legal status of the plant. And in places where it is legal, or in certain areas, where you can get research funding, it's really going to, take off. So I think it's a very exciting time to be involved in research, but there are so many different aspects of the industry. And I think that the best way to start is in university. Start thinking about, do I want to be a medical doctor? Do I want to go to medical school and then specialize in cannabis? Now, you can't get specific training in cannabis right now, but there are plenty of physicians who have been practicing for a while and now work at, medical clinics. And that's also a really exciting opportunity. I work with someone who's that's his goal, is finish, medical school and then become a cannabis physician. So there are many avenues, and reach out to people. Don't be shy. I've never had someone in the industry say, oh, I'm too busy, I don't want to talk to you. It's the opposite. We have so many passionate people that are very knowledgeable, and it's just a great place to be.
It's there for you to make of it what you want, really, isn't it? If once you get involved and start speaking to people, you can pursue any conversation, pursue any sort of avenue. So yeah, I think that's why we like it, no, Loren. You get a lot more freedom than you would in any other sector, and there's a lot more opportunities, and yeah, a bit more of a community as well. And we've all sort of found ourselves on LinkedIn as the haven.
It's an amazing community. Like, oh my God, I've talked to people, just for interviews, and they're like, do you want me to send you something? Like, will you just, be careful with the packaging? And I'm like, that's okay, but oh my God, that's so kind of you. Like, or I've been on calls where people have been like, oh yeah, I know this product that was, tested, and maybe try that for your endometriosis.
Yeah. Let me send you a sample.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Super people. There's a lot. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of it's a sport. There's a lot of competition. There's a lot of different interest, but the core of it, there is a wonderful science community to tap into. And again, I think as a testament to that, Loren, thank you for coming and sharing your time and knowledge, and for sitting and doing this podcast with me. And really appreciate you breaking down some of that. And I've got so many notes here. We'll have to do maybe we do like a follow-up article and touch on a few more things, or summarize a few points that we maybe didn't finish. But I'm going to take so many clips from this and pass them on. And thank you so much, Loren. Very much appreciate your time. And thank you,
Chris, also for all the wonderful work that you're doing in the industry. You're doing great things. You're one of the really good ones. So so glad that we were able to connect and hopefully, continue to chat and work together.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of the Canna-Man podcast. For more information on how you can safely navigate the cannabis ecosystem, take a look at some of our educational materials or reach out to us at www.globalcannabinoidsolutions.com. We look forward to you joining us on the next episode of the Canna-Man podcast.